I posted this sentence from the preface to a book called A History of German Philosophy by Vittorio Hessel. It's H-O umlaut S-L-E. And he was discussing what makes German culture unique and why he was justified in referring to something called German philosophy. And in the process, he referred to what's unique about French, English, and American philosophy and culture. And one of the things he said about American culture, in contrast with German culture, is the form of religiosity that has taken hold in the United States of America. And what he said about it is that whereas the Germans take their religion in a philosophical sense and want to conceptually clarify it and make it rational, make it reasonable, right? Americans couldn't care less about a rational religion. There's more, from his perspective, Hazel's perspective, superficiality and baseness to American culture when it comes to our religious belief. And, this led me to make a comment on Twitter about how I hoped that process theology would permeate American culture more. Process theology comes out of the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, who was actually a British philosopher, but he came to America in 1925 to teach at Harvard. He had been known as a mathematician and a physicist before coming to the States, but Harvard hired him to teach philosophy. And in articulating his process philosophy or process relational philosophy, he found it necessary to refer to God or to construct a God concept that plays a functional role in his system, which he articulates most fully in Process and Reality. It was published in 1929. It was the Gifford Lectures, originally, several years before it was published as a book. The way that Whitehead's thought survived and really flourished in America was through the community of process theologians that took up Whitehead's philosophy and made it fit the needs of a particular kind of church and a theology that would support that kind of church, say that kind of church community. So I'm thinking of people like Charles Hartshorne and John Cobb, David Ray Griffin, and others who made Whitehead's philosophy serve a religious calling. Now, for Whitehead, it's not that he wasn't a religious man. He, was raised by an Anglican priest and educator, and his grandfather also was an Anglican priest and educator. And Whitehead carries that Christian ethos and mythos in his bones and in his heart. But he's also carrying something else, which is a thought child or an idea child of his own, which is this notion of God in process, which is God in relation to the world in a way that's quite foreign to the Christian and the Judaic understanding of God's relationship to the world. In the Judaic and the Christian, or let's say the biblical traditions, God is separate from the world. God is the artisan, the potter, the architect or engineer of the universe, who out of raw material fashions a world. And that world is designed in the way that an engineer would design a machine. And God is perfectly free, and the world is perfectly determined, and so on, right? This is the biblical idea of God. And Whitehead's God, the God of process theology, is not the creator of the world, but the co-creator of the world. because we're all beings, all creatures are co-creators. And yes, God is a creature in Whitehead's philosophy. God is the primordial creature, right? The prime creature of creativity, capital C creativity, which is Whitehead's ultimate, not God, but creativity is the ultimate principle of reality. What there finally is creativity. And creativity is in the business of making creatures, right? Creatures, those finite beings, finite instantiations of creativity that arise and perish, that are born and that die. And that's what we are. And we, as beings in need of theology, right, in need of ideas about God, and beings in need of religion and religious community, spiritual community, we are expressions of the divine. And so Whitehead will say that the only power that God possesses in his process relational universe, the only power God possesses is the love of those who worship him. So God's power is determined by the worship that God inspires. That's how Whitehead looks at it. So in other words, God's existence, God's power, God's capacity to have an effect on the world, and I mean that as being a cause that has an effect. God is effective, and also God is a feeler. God as affected by what happens, and God as having a stake in the world, right? So for Whitehead, God is a fellow sufferer who understands. For God to have any effect, it must come through our action, because we are God's hands, we are God's eyes, right? And so it's not that God, for Whitehead, is just a construct of the human imagination, right? Or as Kant thought, that God is an ideal postulate that we must morally, affirm, a sort of transcendental condition of our own existence as free beings. Like, we have to believe in God to be moral. That's the Kantian take. Whitehead's not saying that, and he's not saying that God's just a figment of our imagination that we, project in order to stay sane. No, it's that human beings are an example of one creature participating in a wider cosmic ecology of molecules and atoms, of stars and galaxies, right, of other species of biological organism on this planet. And seems to be some kind of band practice going on. I'm going to walk this way. We're all part of a divine happening. So Whitehead's God isn't exactly a single thing. It's more pluralistic than that. Whitehead's a panentheist, not a simple pantheist. Not that there's anything simple about, like Spinoza's pantheism, but not simple in the sense of being all one. Whitehead's God isn't all one. Whitehead's God is also many. God of manyness and oneness. So Whitehead's God is clearly a God of paradox, right? So how do we make this relevant to our day-to-day lives? This all can seem rather abstract and even logically contradictory to think of a God that is both eternal and historical, or God that is both creator and receiver of the evolutionary process. How do we enact this in our day-to-day lives? Well, it has profound implications for how we make community, for how we ritualize, for how we create habits, right, and form our lives together, which of course means that it has profound political implications. Many Whiteheadians have been arguing for a kind of organic or re-enchanted socialism. Does this follow necessarily? Is a form of eco-socialism a necessary consequence or a implication of or application of Whitehead's process philosophy to politics? I tend to think so, but I'm open to having that discussion with people. I think it's an interesting one. Psychologically, what Whitehead's process theology means is that the human soul is not an anomaly in the universe, and that our, the so-called modern condition of alienation from nature and from God, who doesn't exist, the modern condition of the alienation from a crossed-out God, is these have profound psychological implications, and Whitehead's telling us to wake up from that nightmare. So we're not separate from God. God is a real psychological actor, an element, an ingredient in our soul lives, inextricably. So for Whitehead, the modern atheist hasn't rid themselves of God. They're just worshiping God in a different way, in a way that a rebellious child or adolescent tries to run away from his or her parents. So Whitehead, the psychology that would follow from Whitehead would be a kind of God therapy, where we accept the fact that we desire to be gods and yet arise out of an evolutionary process of, matter and energy and billions of years of biological birth and sex and death. And yet, here we are, human beings, striving to be divine. Despite our lowly origins, we're reaching to the sky and trying to unite, or is it reunite ourselves with the stars? So that's a Whiteheadian aspiration, if process theology would be our orienting idea of God and the universe.